Evet, Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden konuklarla farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye, olaylara farklı milletlerin gözünden bakmaya çalışıyoruz. Geçtiğimiz haftalarda olduğu gibi bu haftada yine Rusya ve Ukrayna'yı konuşmaya devam edeceğiz. Rusya'nın Ukrayna'yı işgal edeceği iddiasıyla başlayan ve giderek tırmanan tansiyon zirveye ulaştı, korkulan oldu. Haftalardır konuşulan senaryo ne yazık ki gerçekleşti. Rusya'nın Ukrayna işgali resmen başladı. Rus işgalinin nereye kadar gideceği, savaşın daha ne kadar tırmanacağı tüm dünya için ciddi bir korku ve endişe kaynağı şu anda. Geçtiğimiz haftalarda siyaset bilimi ve uluslararası ilişkiler alanından Rus ve Ukraynalı akademisyenlerle meseleyi konuşmuştuk. Bu hafta bir tarihçiyle konuşmak istedik. Zira tarihin pek çok konuda bugüne ışık tuttuğu bir gerçek. Rusya Devlet Başkanı Putin de yaptığı konuşmada Ukrayna operasyonuna gerekçe gösterirken Ukrayna'nın aslında hiçbir zaman gerçek bir devlet olmadığını, modern Ukrayna'nın Rusya tarafından kurulduğunu savunarak çok sayıda tarihi iddiada bulunmuştu. Bu nedenle bu hafta meseleye tarihi bir arka plan eşliğinde bakacağız. Rusya, Doğu Avrupa tarihi ve İkinci Dünya Savaşı konularında çalışan, Ukrayna ile ilgili bir de kitabı bulunan Koç Üniversitesi Tarih Bölümü öğretim üyesi Doçent Doktor Tarik Cyril Amar bizlerle. Hoş geldiniz hocam. Welcome Professor. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, Russian military activity in eastern Ukraine has been escalating for the past few weeks, and following the Russian recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk in Donbas region as independent states, a full-scale invasion has begun, unfortunately, as predicted by the West. I assume that recent developments were quite foreseeable for a historian like you. First of all, I would like to start by asking, Professor, how do you assess the recent developments? Do you think this is the end of the crisis, or we are only in the beginning?
First of all, I would like to say that in all due humility, I think to foresee everything that is happening now and that has happened over the last 2 days, in particular, the Russian invasion of all of Ukraine was actually not easy. It is, of course, true that we have had many Western news based on unnamed intelligence sources that have predicted this invasion. But the predictions were made so frequently that it became very difficult to trust them. And in the end, nobody, of course, knew what would really happen finally, what would be the decision made in Moscow. We now know, and the general significance of this invasion, I think, is catastrophic. It's a major turning point in the history of our times. It will be remembered as that. There is a way in which we cannot yet predict if the crisis will end soon or if it will take a much longer time to finally return to some sort of normalcy. I think that the relationship between the West and Russia is going to remain extremely tense for a long time, even if it should be possible to end the immediate hostilities in Ukraine soon. This crisis and the way Putin has acted, which is criminal and I would say evil in moral terms, will leave very deep traces, and it will take a long time to work that out, whatever exactly happens on the ground in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. We will come to the tension between West and Russia, and we will talk about it in more details, Professor, but I would like to go from here to Putin's logic. You also touched upon. Many of us, to be honest, have been trying to understand why. Why is Putin doing this now? Russia justifies its actions with security reasons, namely Ukraine's wish to join NATO, NATO expansion to Eastern Europe, etc. But I want to get some historical perspective and background today. What are the root causes of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine today?
Yeah. Look, I think we need to distinguish between what you're actually asking about right now, which is a very good question, of course, which is what are the root causes of the crisis? And the other question would be, what are the causes that we have seen this war now, right? So these are two different things.
Yes.
About the war, the way that this crisis has now gone to an extremely dramatic and horrible level, about the war, I would say the root cause is Putin. It really boils down to one man. And if this one particular person hadn't decided to take it to this level of violence and destruction, we wouldn't see that. Now, about the crisis, your original question, of course, which is very important, there I would say we are looking at something much more complicated. This is not just about him personally. This is in part about the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, where the current tension has deep roots. And it is in part about the way in which Russia sees that it has been treated since the end of the Cold War by the West in general. So there are these two lines, I think, that are active in Russian motivations and that fuel, as it were, this ongoing crisis.
Professor, well, in Putin's recent speech was also very remarkable. I think it was not very surprising to hear what he said to you, probably, but he says Russia and Ukraine are historically one people, and he already declared that when Russia annexed Crimea, and he has repeated these claims many times. The histories of Ukraine and Russia are surely very much related and interconnected via the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, via religion, etc. But this shared history rhetoric can look very different from different angles, different perspectives. So as a historian, I want to ask you about the Russian interpretation of Ukrainian history. What are the facts, myths, and flaws here? And how does the Russian interpretation contribute to the crisis between Russia and Ukraine today?
So let me stress, first of all, that in Russia, of course, there are also many Russians who do not share Putin's view, fortunately. So if I may, I would like to speak more specifically about Putin's view of history and Ukrainian history and the history between Ukraine and Russia. And there, I think the most important point to keep in mind is that it's a caricature, right? Putin he picks certain aspects of the historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia, which was and has been very tight indeed, and builds his own picture on this. And this picture is highly distorted. The contention that is at the center of his thinking and of his claims that somehow Russians and Ukrainians are identical is nonsense. One has to be very clear about this. It would be equally wrong, completely misguided, to say, for instance, that the Dutch and the Germans are the same, or that the French and the Belgians are the same, right? This is nonsense. This is just not true. There is a long history between Ukraine and Russia that goes back really to the 9th century after Christ, if you want, where their histories have interacted. This is absolutely true. But at the same time, Ukraine, for several hundred years already, hundreds of years, has undergone a process of forming itself into a nation and identity of its own. At the same time, this identity has in many ways still preserved links to Russia. This is also true. And it may be one of the tragedies of Putin that he is the person who has now done most to destroy a fruitful relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And I say this deliberately. There have been others as well, I know, but Putin has done most and the worst to destroy a healthy relationship between Ukraine and Russia.
I understand. Also, Professor, his recent speech was full of historical references. He thinks the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in recent history. And he put some blame on Lenin. So I wonder, what are your thoughts about this historical judgments he made? Do you agree that he is trying to rewrite history and reviving Russian Empire?
No, I don't agree with that. I have a highly critical view of him, but in my view, we don't know that. And we assume that far too quickly. His actions can be explained in various ways. And one of them still is that what he is doing mostly is to be explained by a sort of modern Russian nationalism. That's not the same as empire rebuilding, either the rebuilding of the old Tsarist empire or the rebuilding of the Soviet Union. I don't actually think we know that at all. In fact, I think that he targets specific places such as Belarus and Ukraine, that is true, but those do not amount to the former Soviet Union. I do not think that, for instance, he actually wants the Baltic states back. He may want to, in some way, have pressure on the Baltic states, but I don't think he actually wants them back in the same state as Russia. So literally speaking, I don't think we can assume that we can explain his actions by trying to resurrect some sort of empire. I know that Joe Biden, the American president, has just repeated this line, but I think we are just guessing there. And it doesn't really make so much difference anymore as to how the West has to react. Because if you look at the facts on the ground, he is now waging a war of aggression. It's very, very clear it's against international law. He's not the only one who's done this recently, but that's what he's doing now. And the main question is not so much why exactly he's doing it. The question is, how do we get him to stop?
Mm-hmm. Well, since you mentioned that, I will ask that question now then. Economic sanctions against Russia don't really seem to be enough to persuade Putin to change his mind. And if history is any guide, major powers are like Russia are not really dissuaded by sanctions. So do you think these sanctions will really stop him? Or what is going to stop him in your view then, if these sanctions are not going to work?
The sanctions that have now passed will not stop him. I think that's already clear. Because they look very impressive. They target major Russian banks now. They do. But at the same time, there's a very important exception in that sanctions regime that has to do with anything that concerns energy. And there the West has put its interests first and has seen to it that when transactions are about energy that it wants to buy from Russia, then these sanctions won't actually work or do much harm. And since so much of Russian income actually does come from the energy trade, the sanctions that have now passed will not stop him. Mm-hmm. Now, the West also does not have a military option. It doesn't, because a direct clash between, for instance, the troops of NATO, US, British, German, you name it, mm-hmm. or the Poles, and the Russian army would be suicidal for this world. That's something where we cannot go. I think Joe Biden is completely right about this, to take that off the table. We cannot risk World War III. So we cannot stop him militarily. The West cannot stop him militarily. And our sanctions don't have a good record and don't look very hopeful either. What is left? We can either increase the sanctions again, which I think the West may have to do, or we can negotiate, or we can do both. And if you ask me personally, I think we should do both. We should, of course, introduce sanctions, and probably even more sanctions than have already been introduced. But we will also have to negotiate with him. And here's an important distinction. The West cannot concede on the existence of Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent state. If Putin really wants to destroy Ukraine as such, there's nothing we can negotiate there. But the West can and should concede on NATO. I'm absolutely convinced of this. I've been convinced of this since December. And I think it is one of the terrible mistakes that the West has made here, not to talk to Putin about not letting Ukraine into NATO. It would be better for Ukraine, and making Ukraine neutral. And if you look at the very latest events, it seems now from the latest news, as far as I understand, that that type of settlement is being talked about even by the Ukrainian government, now. We don't know yet how the Russians will react. I hope they react positive, but we don't know this. But did we really have to go through 2 days of devastating war in Ukraine to get to this place? We didn't. The West, from December, should have reacted more positively to Russia's demand to stop NATO expansion. I'm absolutely convinced on that. It doesn't make a difference to the fact that Putin is a criminal and evil. This is all true. But the West failed Ukraine in a terrible way. but not being ready to make a compromise about this.
I see. Well, Professor, you also now bring this issue, and as you also mentioned, the main problem highlighted by this crisis has predominantly focused on the role of NATO. And the Kremlin claims the West broke a promise it made in the 90s not to expand NATO, and Russia is now using this claim to justify its military aggression in Ukraine. So I wonder, really, could you please tell us the history behind Russia's claim that NATO promised not to expand to the east, or Putin is just rewriting history again by his claims?
In my view, this is a very contentious question among experts, and I don't claim to know best, but in my view, Russia is right about this. Promises were made twice in 1990 during the unification negotiations for Germany after the wall came down, and in 1993 again, having to do with the future of the then NATO program of Partnership for Peace. Promises were made. Now, formally speaking, NATO as such never made such a promise. This is true. But what did happen is that two American secretaries of state, two American foreign ministers, James Baker and Warren Christopher, talked to the highest Russian leadership and talked to them as if they could talk for NATO. Now put yourself into the position of the Russian leaders of the time. If the American foreign minister talks to you and says, I can speak for NATO, you believe it, because in the real world, the US actually does dominate NATO, right? So in both cases, in 1990, it was a bit more ambiguous, I admit that, but in 1993, it was very clear. It was the Americans specifically, not NATO, but the Americans, who took it on themselves to speak for NATO and promise the Russians, in essence, that NATO would not expand, at least not via full membership, right? In the middle 1990s, there was an alternative in place already, the Partnership for Peace system, the Partnership for Peace system. The Russians were okay with that at the time. They didn't like it, but they agreed to that. This should have been what NATO should have done in the future. But NATO instead, after promising the Russians otherwise, after the Americans promised the Russians otherwise, the Americans also changed their mind under Bill Clinton, this is on him, and then switched the policy to expanding to full membership, right? This is very real. In this respect, Russia has a very real point, and I would go further. This is not about Putin. Every Russian leader right now would have exactly the same problem with NATO. Every Russian leader, because there is a direct clash of Russian national interests and what NATO has done. And NATO needs to revise its course now, and the Americans as well.
But Professor, here I'm really trying to understand, I'm really lost sometimes, because if an independent state wants to join a defense organization, at the end of the day, NATO is not a terrorist organization, it's a defense organization. It protects countries in case of a war and something. So if an independent state wants to join NATO or European Union or any other international organization, and if they feel threatened by Russia or by other countries, Russia has really has a valid point to say that, well, I feel threatened by the NATO expansion. It feels like to me that it is like saying that, I want to attack a country whenever I want. So it is pretty much saying this. What do you think about this? I mean, Ukraine is an independent country in the end, and it wants to join NATO. So what is the problem here? Why is this such a red line for Putin, for Russia?
Well, Russia doesn't see NATO as a purely defensive organization. We see NATO as a purely defensive organization, but in foreign politics between powerful states, it doesn't matter what only one side thinks. It matters what everybody thinks. These perceptions matter. And Russia has an argument in that if you look at Kosovo, if you look at Libya, if you look at Afghanistan, NATO, since the end of the Cold War, has not been purely defensive. It has been interventionist, and you could also call it aggressive. So I do not believe NATO, this slightly innocent-looking discourse that it spins about we are purely defensive, There are reasons why Russia doesn't just want to believe it. This is due diligence security thinking. If we were in the Russian shoes, we would also not just believe it. That's not how this works. The other thing is, Ukraine has every right to want to be in NATO. Yes, I've always said that. But NATO has no obligation to accept Ukraine. That is not true. That is something that has been spread, and it's propaganda, it's false. NATO admission is decided by unanimous consent of every current NATO member. Every single current member of NATO has to agree so that a new member can join. That's the NATO treaty. And that rule means there is no automatism. It's simply not true that a country can say, I want to be in, and therefore I will get in. It's not true. Now, Ukraine has one argument in favor of their NATO aspirations, if they're still there, which is that NATO in 2008 promised Ukraine in a very vague way that someday it would be in NATO. That's true. NATO made this promise. Now, that promise is not binding. NATO can retract this promise. It should never have made it. It made the promise to two countries on the same occasion, Georgia and Ukraine. And what has happened to both of them? They were both attacked by Russia, and not only were they attacked by Russia, nobody helped them. That is the true outcome of this promise. NATO made these countries hope that someday they would be protected, and then it let them down. And this was foreseeable. And this is one of the most terrible things the West has done here. The West has to make up its mind. Either it offers membership and therefore exposes countries to Russia's wrath and the danger from Russia, but then it also needs to actually protect them. Or it goes to the same countries and it's honest and it says, we cannot protect you, which is the truth, because you're too close to Russia. We cannot protect you. So please do not try to become a member because it only exposes you to risk. This is on NATO, actually.
I see. Okay, a different perspective. Thank you very much. Professor, unfortunately, I have just 2 minutes left, but I want to ask you one more question before we close. We hear a lot of World War III scenarios and fears these days. And US President also, Biden, said, you know, World War II was a war of necessity, but if Russia attacks Ukraine, it will be a war of choice. As a historian who studied the previous war, do you see such a risk of another one in the near future? And if yes, is there a way to prevent it?
As long as the Western powers in NATO do not intervene directly in Ukraine, and they don't seem to want to do this, the risk of a widening into World War III is low. It's never not there. We shouldn't be that close to it, but it's low. Now, Joe Biden is right in one respect. For Russia, this is a war of choice, and the other term for this is a war of aggression. This is very, very clear. If it was up to me, Putin belongs in an international court. I think together with people like Tony Blair and George Bush for what they did to Iraq, which was actually a war of aggression as well. I wished we lived in a world where leaders who do these things get punished, but we don't. They don't get punished in the West, and unfortunately, Putin will probably not be punished either. But he's a criminal and he's evil, there's no doubt.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Unfortunately, time is up. Thank you very much for bringing us some historical perspective. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Evet, saat farkını bu haftada noktalamış olduk. Rusya-Ukrayna krizine, Ukrayna'daki Rus işgaline biraz tarihi bir perspektiften bakmış olduk bugün. Koç Üniversitesi'nde şu anda görev yapan doçent doktor Tarik Cyril Amar ile biraz meselenin tarihini konuştuk. Önümüzdeki hafta tekrar görüşmek dileğiyle diyelim. Hoşça kalın.